Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Usually, most of our sessions are related to investigation. We are trying to look for the clues related to the fraud cases. We are trying to uncover fraud, discussing corruption and bribery and financial statement fraud. But today we are taking different approach. Today we are putting all our investigation tools on the side and we are taking different approach completely. Rather than trying to uncover the fraud, we are going to be speaking about how can we fight fraud inside your organization. How can we implement the proper anti-fraud strategy where you will be able to have the proper internal controls to prevent and detect fraud. And we are going to discuss this by speaking about the latest update by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners and Grant Thornton related to anti-fraud playbook. Today we have with us amazing two global speakers, James and Sophia, and they are going to share with you how you need to implement the proper strategies inside your organization to fight fraud. They are going to be speaking with you about all the strategies that you need to have to be able to have the proper, not only defensive system, but the way for you to combat fraud and fight back. And with that, I would like them to start their presentation. Thank you so much for joining our global webinar, and I hope that you will enjoy our presentation today. James and Sophia, the stage is for you.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining our program today. Sophia and I are dialing in from the East Coast of the United States, and happy to chat with you today about our anti-fraud playbook. Just by way of introduction, my name is James Ruotolo. I'm a senior manager here at Grant Thornton. Grant Thornton is a international consulting and accounting firm. We're almost 100 years old now. In the United States, we've got about 7,000 employees that focus on tax, auditing, and providing consulting services. Fraud is certainly a big part of our business. We do a lot of fraud investigation work. Sophia and I have been spending a lot of time recently on proactive work, so helping organizations establish a good defensive posture and make sure they have the right structure in their organization for preventing and detecting fraud. Grant Thornton is also part of a larger international firm. We've got about 56,000 employees globally in over 140 countries. So many of you may have worked with some Grant Thornton folks across the world. So thank you for joining today. Sophia, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yes, I would love to introduce myself. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Like James said, good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you all are at. I'm Sophia Carlton. I am a manager at Grant Thornton, and over the last 5 years, I've worked to help organizations of all shapes and sizes across different industries proactively prevent and detect fraud by standing up comprehensive fraud risk management programs. And I was the lead author of the Anti-Fraud Playbook, and so I'm really excited to talk to you all about that today with James here and answer your questions at the end.
Super, let's jump right in, Sophia, if we can get maybe to the agenda. Just a couple of topics that we plan to cover today. I'll give you a brief introduction about how the playbook was created, and then Sophia is going to take us through the first half of the plays that are in the playbook and give you some of the details. And then I'll close it off with a few additional comments. We'll try to leave a few minutes at the end for Q&A. And with that, let's jump right into it. So back in 1992, the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations created the Internal Control Framework. And some of you may be familiar with some of these documents, but back in 2013, they established 17 principles, one of which includes a principle focused around fraud. Fast forward a couple of years, and the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners partnered with COSO to develop the Fraud Risk Management Guide. And so several of you may have seen this, you may use this in your work. We found this to be a tremendous resource for organizations that are looking to establish a really strong anti-fraud program within their organization. But one of the challenges we had with that guide is it has a lot of information, and sometimes people struggle with trying to figure out where to get started. So we collaborated at Grant Thornton with ACFE to publish the Anti-Fraud Playbook, which we just launched at the Global ACFE conference this year. So we're going to make these slides available to you. Happy to also make a copy of that playbook available to everyone and you can also download that from the ACFE website. And we'll give you some more details about that in a moment. So if we push forward here onto the next slide, the fraud risk management guide has requirements around fraud governance, around risk assessment, and so forth. And it's got some really tremendous information, a lot of detail. Again, we see this as an exceptionally good tool to help organizations establish a fraud risk management program. But a lot of groups, when they look at it, maybe they're not fraud experts, maybe they're not ACFE or CFEs, maybe they don't have all that fraud experience. They find it a little overwhelming, a little daunting. So we took that information and specifically around the principles that were focused around fraud from COSO and the details that were provided in this risk management guide, and then created a simpler version. And so that's what you really see in this anti-fraud playbook. So as we push forward here, Sophia, to the next slide, within the playbook and within the playbook, we have plays that map to the 5 principles that you see outlined here that are provided by COSO. So to set the stage, those are around governance, right? You need to have a structure. Often organizations will have a fraud risk committee, for example, and they'll have resources within their organization who are dedicated to focusing on fraud risk management. It requires fraud risk assessments. And this is one where we see a lot of organizations take a number of different approaches. Some people do this in a very basic way, others have a very complex process. But essentially, you should do an assessment of your fraud risk. You should understand what the targets are, what the channels and the avenues are that fraud can be committed against your organization. And that includes both internal and external fraud. And then you should implement controls. So you want to have controls in place to prevent the fraud from occurring. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with implementing or auditing or evaluating some of those controls. Certainly, controls are good, but they don't always work. And so you need to have a process for doing an investigation and taking corrective action if some sort of suspected fraudulent activity does occur. And then finally, you'd have to monitor your fraud program and do some reporting around it, right? So these are the 5 main principles that are included in COSO. So if we flip forward, the guide that we produce in the anti-fraud playbook really takes these concepts and breaks them down into some individual plays. So we've got all 5 of those principles from COSO that are included, and then we've broken them down to 2 plays for each principle that gives you a lot of detail about how to actually get started. So that's kind of the broad overview. Let me turn it over to Sophia, and then we can talk through some of the specific plays that we've got in the playbook and how you can take this information and really implement a strong anti-fraud and fraud risk management program in your organization.
James. So building off of the introduction that James just gave, we're going to walk through and give an overview of the different phases and the plays within the anti-fraud playbook. So first, just looking at it holistically, right? So there are 5 phases and 10 plays. So you can see that each phase, right, fraud risk governance, fraud risk assessment, control activities, and so on, each have 2 plays within them. And all of these phases align, like James mentioned, right back to the COSO and ACFE's fraud risk management guide. And so what we did was choose topics within each of those key principles and created plays to help operationalize the guidance set forth in the guide itself. So we're going to walk through each of these areas now. So first, taking a look at fraud risk governance. So play 1 is really a baselining or level setting to ensure that you have the proper foundation for a fraud risk management program. And so it's titled Understand Where You Are and Where You Want to Be. And so the key here is that fraud risk management should be right-sized and tailored for the unique needs of an organization. So what that means is that not every organization needs to get to level 5 here in this maturity model, right? Some organizations might only need to get to a level 3. And the level of maturity that they require might also differ across the different components, right? So fraud risk governance, maybe they need to be a level 5. But for monitoring, maybe they only need to be a level 3. So understanding that this kind of right sizing and tailored approach can ensure that organizations can invest the right resources where it will have the biggest impact and in areas of highest priority for their organization. So the way that we recommend doing this is conducting a maturity assessment. So first, understand where the program stands today, so the current state, and that would be overall and across each of these 5 principles, right? So a lot of times we see that organizations might have higher levels of maturity across fraud risk governance, control activities, and investigation, but might be lacking in risk assessment and monitoring. So that's where you want to make sure that you get that overall picture and dive into each of those principles. And then once you understand where you are, getting to our title here, right? Where do you want to be? What's that goal state? What's your long-term vision for the fraud risk management program? And then you can start to develop a roadmap to close the gap between the current and the goal states. And so another key piece here is going beyond that roadmap and developing an anti-fraud strategy. So this is a really great time as you're talking about where you see your program now and where you see it down the line, is to understand how you want to approach fraud risk management as an organization and what that strategy looks like. So what are those emerging risks you want to stay on top of? How do you plan to invest resources in technologies or process improvements? So making sure that you have a strategy that can serve as the basis for those important decision-making discussions so that there is that foundation there. So really the output of this would be having a roadmap to focus on the gaps from the current and future states, but also having that strategy or that strategic plan in place to ensure that you know not only where you're headed, but how you want to get there. So looking forward towards a culture. So fraud risk governance play 2 is create a culture. So as anti-fraud professionals, I'm sure that most of you are aware of how important culture is, but culture can either greatly reduce your risk of fraud or can have the exact opposite effect. So a strong anti-fraud culture is important to enhancing fraud awareness, encouraging employees to discuss fraud risk openly and thoughtfully. And it's really from that top down, right? Making sure that message is clear. And like fraud risk management being not a one size fits all, culture and how you approach it is not one size fits all either. So there are a lot of different ways that you can start to build a foundation of a strong anti-fraud culture. A few things that we would recommend is ensuring that you have a comprehensive fraud risk policy, that you have an enterprise-wide anti-fraud training program, including both your internal staff and relevant external parties, and then conducting a culture assessment, right? So you might not even know where your culture stands right now or today. And so a key part of going beyond and ensuring that you do have that solid foundation is understanding the current state again. And so if your culture is really strong, that assessment should showcase that, but it will also showcase areas where there might be gaps or opportunities for improvement. So for example, we talk a lot about tone at the top, but another important area to ensure is effective is tone at the middle or even peer-to-peer. So generally our direct managers and the peers that we work with every day can have a bigger impact on our behavior and how we approach ethical behavior as well. And so making sure that those foundational elements of your culture are strong and that peers are encouraging each other to do the right thing, and that middle management is also encouraging that type of ethical behavior and decision making is also really important. So that's where a culture assessment can help you understand where are we lacking, and that way we can focus our efforts. Maybe it's our awareness initiatives, our training, whatever it may be, we can focus it in those areas that are currently bigger gaps than others. Another element that we've developed here is the fraud triangle versus the integrity triangle. And so the fraud triangle has 3 sides: opportunity, motivation, and rationalization. And so we can understand how these things all come to light in our day-to-day lives. So for example, speeding, right? So we have the opportunity to speed, maybe in our cars, right? So maybe we have, we see that there is not a police officer around, or there is not a camera on the traffic light. Motivation, we're running late to a meeting, we need to pick up a family member. And rationalization, right? Everyone speeds, you know, it's not a big deal. I'm not gonna hurt anyone by going 5 miles over the speed limit. Right, so that's an example of how this comes to fruition, and it can easily come to fruition in an organization and even from external actors. So the integrity triangle is a counterbalance of that, and it has responsibility, accountability, and authority. And so this is a way to help instill into the employees and stakeholders across your organization that they have this responsibility to act with responsibility, accountability, and authority, right? Everybody has a role in fraud risk management. And if they act with these values in mind, they can help prevent and detect fraud from occurring, right? So that might be protecting customers, it might be protecting their peers, it might be protecting the organization as a whole, but instilling that sense of responsibility is key, right? It's that kind of see something, say something attitude is really important. And so it's a great way you can embed this concept into your anti-fraud training materials and ensure that that is very clear what everyone's role in fraud risk management is. Oftentimes we see that in organizations, people across the organization are not clear that they even have a role in fraud risk management, right? And so that's where the integrity triangle can help, is everyone can serve as this counterbalance to bad behavior and can help proactively combat those bad actors. So looking here at play 3, so moving from fraud risk governance to fraud risk assessment. So fraud risk assessment, we're kicking off here with play 3, think like a fraudster. And this is a really important part of fraud risk assessment, but we did kind of separate it out here because it is almost the step you have to do before you assess risks, right? You have to identify risks first. And so identifying vulnerabilities and likely fraud schemes, whether they're internal or external, is imperative to informing your fraud risk assessment. And so we kind of have coined this think like a fraudster, right? So put on your fraudster hat and brainstorm ways that a bad actor who was motivated to commit fraud, how would they do that, right? What areas of your organization are vulnerable to external actors? Where do you have the most kind of internal assets? So resources, information, even finding like money, right? So where are those assets, and who has access to steal them or misuse them? And so we then recommend taking all of that brainstorming and putting it into a fraud risk map. That way you can really understand your universe of fraud schemes. So we have this graphic here, right, of thinking like a fraudster. So Janet always leaves her computer unlocked, right? So when she steps away, I can hack in and get customer information or change payment information to my own bank account. My supervisor and I need fast cash. I'll pad my timesheet and we'll split the money. So just thinking about ways that if someone was motivated to commit fraud, how would they do it? And it looks like maybe, James, you want to add something in here?
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. I was just going to say, this think like a fraudster concept is really powerful because for 2 reasons. One, I think it's really an exciting and kind of fun way to create fraud awareness in your organization. So you ask people in a workshop to get together and think about the different ways fraud might be committed. And invariably, when you get a group together, they come up with some very creative methods about how an organization could be defrauded. And so that helps you identify what your true fraud risks are, but it also helps the employees really be thinking about fraud awareness and how they can better detect fraud or prevent fraud in their normal job, even if that's not a normal part of their responsibility, right? So if they're just operating in a regular frontline business function, this exercise can really help them just be aware of the different types of things that people could do to commit fraud. And so, we know we'll talk a little bit more in the presentation about training and awareness, but I think this can be a great exercise to really help establish that mindset within your organization. And it's kind of a fun way to do it.
Yeah, thanks, James. And that's very true, right? So think like a fraudster sounds like more fun than let's get together and think about fraud schemes, right? So definitely it's a great way to approach stakeholders at an organization, and it's a good activity to just get people in a room. And we always recommend doing this cross-functionally as well, so that people at all points of the process are involved, because each of those people will have different insights and perspectives into how within their own part of the process fraud might occur. And then it can facilitate the understanding across the entire process, right? An end-to-end discussion. So thinking about a fraud risk map, there are a lot of different ways that you can build one out. And so we've listed here things that you would want to include at a minimum, and then other elements that you can include. So we generally recommend building or segregating out your fraud risk map into how you plan to perform your fraud risk assessment. So that might be for different business units or lines of business, departments, etc. So whatever that looks like at the organization. So that way you can develop tailored fraud schemes for each of those areas. Then we recommend actor, fraud risk entry point, and scheme. So actor, who's committing the scheme, right? Are they internal or external to the organization? Is it a member of management? Is it a customer, a vendor, an unrelated third party, right? So who are we envisioning commit this scheme? This is important because different people will commit the same type of scheme in different ways, right? So a vendor will commit a invoice fraud differently than someone internal to the organization. So understanding that will help us kind of track the life cycle of that fraud event so we can understand what controls are in place and where the organization might be vulnerable. And then to that end, fraud risk entry point, right? So what is that mechanism? What is the thing that the fraudster is exploiting to commit this fraud? And then the scheme itself. So what is actually taking place? Other elements that you can include, and this really just depends on the taxonomy you have developed. Having a fraud taxonomy is a very big foundational element. Doing this process of thinking like a fraudster and developing a fraud risk map is a great way to develop a taxonomy. And so category, fraud type, these are things that depending on the hierarchy of fraud risk that you develop, you might have more than this, right? Sub-schemes, subtypes, right, depending. So it's really up to you and the organization and how detailed they want the taxonomy to be. Other things like related controls and identified control gaps and weaknesses, these are things that we recommend kind of adding on as you conduct the fraud risk assessment. So we really don't want a fraud risk map to kind of be put back on the shelf and collect dust, right? It needs to be a tool, something that's an actionable artifact that organizations can continue to use to identify and assess risks going forward. And so adding elements like controls and identified gaps and weaknesses can make it more actionable, because then we can even filter, right? If we're using Excel, filter for areas where we have gaps. In theory, those are areas we'd be more worried about, right? So then we can help focus our assessment in areas of our biggest weaknesses. And so that's really key here, is making sure that we are creating an actionable artifact. A big piece here is also that fraud risks are always changing and evolving. And so once we create the fraud risk map, we'll have to continue to update it, right? And I think even the global pandemic has shown us how vastly and quickly the fraud risk landscape can change. And we need to make sure that we have a solid process for updating those risks and understanding what those emerging risks are so that we can quickly assess and mitigate against them. So when thinking about your fraud risk map, we wanted to give you guys a few considerations. So first, we recommend organizing your map by your preferred unit of analysis. So this is to my point earlier, to make sure the map aligns to the fraud risk assessment. So for example, if internal audit already has kind of these units that they're assessing, it might be good to use those same units of analysis. So that way, all your identification of risks and assessment can then feed back from the audit process, and you can easily integrate information across the two. Or if your enterprise risk management function already has units, the way they separate the business out, you can leverage those. So thinking about how it can not only align up to the fraud risk assessment, but how it can also be easily integrated strategically with other areas of the business. When identifying fraud schemes, we recommend doing so in a group setting, right? So to James's point earlier, making sure that we get stakeholders together, ask them to think like fraudsters, and really talk about what we think is in the realm of possible. And then we also want to consider the actor and the fraud risk entry point. So these were two things that were kind of the must-haves in our fraud risk map, right? So who's the perpetrator and what function or process are they capitalizing on to carry out the fraud scheme? Another big piece is remembering that not all fraud is financial. Fraud can impact organizations reputationally, even if it doesn't lead to a direct financial loss. I would also add here that even outside of just the impact to the organization, we're not just worried about people walking out with money, right? We're also worried about people taking information, misusing access, abusing their own access to steal and sell information for monetary gain, right? So there's even assets the organization has, right? Like if you think of, maybe you have a work laptop that your organization gave you, or other types of employer assets that we get, right? Those things can be misused and they can add up to a significant impact, even if it's not a direct financial impact. So thinking about fraud more broadly than just someone took money out of a cash register and walked out, right? So that's something we always want to make sure that we call out. And then leverage available resources. There are a lot of resources out there, so you don't necessarily have to start from scratch. This could be existing risk registers at your organization. It could be emerging risks. You know, one thing, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners has the fraud tree, right? So that's a good starting place for internal fraud and building out that taxonomy and thinking about which of those might apply to you. And even recently, the Fed classifier model was released for financial services, right? So there is a lot of different resources and you don't have to start from scratch. And if you do it in a group setting, you also don't have to work alone. So there's just a lot of ways that you can build this out and be successful to ensure that it's a living artifact that does have a pulse on emerging risks. So we did want to show you all an example as well. So certainly this is not the most beautiful example of a fraud risk map, but it is realistic, right? So a lot of times we develop these for organizations in Excel because it's something that everyone has access to. So it's easy to use across the organization. And here we have some columns as examples, right? So business unit, these are all payroll or expense reimbursement examples. So they are all internal frauds. They're all within asset misappropriation, fraudulent disbursements. Then we get to the fraud scheme. So if we look at, for example, mischaracterized expenses, which is that third row here. So mischaracterized expenses, an employee or a member of management submits an expense reimbursement for a personal expense, claiming the expense was business related. And so looking here is the related control activities, which I mentioned earlier, is a great way to ensure that the fraud risk map is actionable. So here we have two examples of controls. Employees are required to submit detailed expense reports containing receipts and explanations and amounts. And then supervisors are required to review and approve all reimbursement requests. So as we're looking at that and we're looking at all the risks in our map, right, we would look at those control activities and start to think, how well do we think those are working? Do we think those are enough? Do we think those are effective, right? And that's where we would start to gather information from other parts of the business. We might start conducting interviews. We would probably want to get stakeholders together in a workshop and really talk through these controls. For example, supervisory review. So while it's something that most organizations rely on, supervisors are busy. And especially if they trust the employees, right? If they've worked together for a long time, they might only do a cursory or a very minimum review of an expense report or an expense reimbursement request. So that control might not be as strong as it appears in practice, right? So as it's written, sounds great. As it's implemented and actually carried out by individuals across the business, it might not be as effective. And so this might be an area where we are relying mostly on supervisory review, then we might be more concerned about that type of control. So then we can make sure we filtered and focused on risks in that space. That's just an example as you start to develop your map and you start to think about how you would use this as part of the assessment process. So finally, our last slide here on thinking like a fraudster, a checklist. So one of the great things about the playbook is that it incorporates the points of focus from the COSO and ACFE Fraud Risk Management Guide. And we translated all of those into very discrete checklists and key questions to ask yourself so that you can really follow along, right? Yep, we've done that, we've done this, we've done that. So that way you can kind of follow along with all the different plays and see where your organization is at. And the key questions really are there to help facilitate decision-making and discussion so that you can figure out how you would tailor what we're recommending in each play for your organization. Because if we haven't said it enough yet, right, fraud risk management is an art, not a science, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. So it should be tailored to your organization. So we wanted to showcase here the checklist for play 3. So first, determine how you want to break out your fraud risk map. We've talked about that, right? Maybe it's department, maybe it's business function, maybe you want to map it to how internal audit or ERM, just depending on your organization. Develop your framework, right? So what is it going to look like? Do we have a taxonomy? How many kind of pieces of the hierarchy do we want to include? Do we want to include controls and control gaps, right? So thinking about what that framework looks like, then actually working to identify the fraud schemes, both internal and external. And so if you do break it out by, for example, business function, you would want to do this type of brainstorming for each business function that you're including. Then you would integrate all the schemes into your comprehensive map. And then, if not most important, periodically refresh and iterate on your fraud risk map, right? So like we've chatted about, fraud risks are constantly evolving and shifting. And so we don't want this map to go stale. We don't want it to collect dust. We want it to be useful. And so periodically refreshing and iterating will help ensure that it stays relevant to the fraud risk landscape of the organization. So now moving into fraud risk assessment. So play 4, discover what you don't know. So conducting a fraud risk assessment helps you understand where your processes are vulnerable and how you can take control. And so I like to describe fraud risk assessment as a tool, right? It should not be, we assessed risks, we found likelihood and impact, here's the list, we're done, right? We put it back on the shelf. We're not taking action. We're not using it for decision-making, right? So organizations that don't do that, who don't use the results for decision-making, who don't look at it as a tool, right, are really missing out on the benefits of fraud risk assessment. And so thinking of it as a tool, it should be dynamic, it should be iterative, right? It's not one and done, and it's something that should have a constant pulse on current and emerging risks across the organization. And so that's really how we would like everyone to think about assessment, right? That it's not this one and done activity where the only goal is to do likelihood and impact or magnitude frequency, whichever terminology an organization uses, right? That's not the only purpose. A fraud risk assessment can help us understand a lot about an organization, right? There was an organization, we conducted a comprehensive fraud risk assessment across over 80 areas of the business. So this included both external facing like products and also internal corporate functions. And we learned more about the processes, controls, the subcultures across each of those areas than that organization had ever had, right? And so we not only got to understand what those controls and processes and subcultures were, but all of that information then got translated into concrete and actionable next steps that were prioritized in areas that we found to be the highest impact. So across your entire organization, here are the top 10 things that you can do right now to close gaps, improve processes, and prevent and detect fraud. And so that's a really great way. If you need to make a case, you get a lot more out of fraud risk assessment than likelihood and impact scores. And if that's all you're getting right now, there's a lot you can do to improve your current assessment process. So looking at developing a methodology. So I mentioned that the playbook has checklists and key questions. So we went over a checklist example for a fraud risk map. This is an example of questions for fraud risk assessment. So some things that you'd want to ask either your organization, or if you're also working with clients, right, that you would ask them. So who's going to be responsible for your fraud risk assessment? Where do you want to start your fraud risk assessment? Which is even a better question sometimes, right? Because not all organizations have the time, the resources to go all in for 80 plus areas like the organization we worked with. Some organizations can only start with one area, or maybe they can only start with 2 or 3, and then you can continue to expand. That's perfectly okay. It's better to do something, start somewhere. That's kind of a mantra that we use all the time, right? Do something, start somewhere. Even if you start small, that's all right. It's better than nothing. And so if you can only start in one area to do a fraud risk assessment, then you can leverage that as a pilot of sorts, right? To develop a methodology, test it out, see if it works, incorporate lessons learned, and then expand over time into other areas of the business. We would recommend that if you can only start small, that try and focus on an area that you think has bigger risks, right? So you can do like a quick exposure analysis, like where do we think we're most exposed to fraud? You can leverage results of audits or enterprise risk, right, to see where we think the business we have the most fraud or the most fraud risk, right? So that can help you pick your starting place more strategically rather than at random. Second here, right, does your organization leverage a likelihood and impact scale? So that's really important too. If your organization already has something in place, you don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? And the more you can leverage things that are already in place, the easier the results from the fraud risk assessment will integrate into the business, and it can more easily be leveraged for decision-making and discussion. How will you educate stakeholders on the process and ensure understanding of key terms and procedures? Now, I don't think many people realize what a big education and training process fraud risk assessments can be. We recommend including people at all levels of the organization. So if we're focusing at a business line or a business function, we would want people all the way from the front line up to senior leadership involved. And so all of those stakeholders are not going to have an equal level of understanding of risk terminology, right? So they might not know what likelihood means or impact or how we would think about that in relation to fraud. They might not understand how to think like a fraudster, right? They might not understand how we would want to continue forward and take action, right? So now that we know this is an area where we're risky or we have a gap, what does that mean? What do we do about that, right? And so education is so important, and it's important because it will ensure that not only they understand this process, but it's a great way, to our earlier point of culture, to continue to create and foster that culture of everyone has a responsibility for fraud risk management. And here's how you can help, right? You can help by participating thoughtfully in the assessment process. And you can help by, after the process, helping us implement these mitigating actions to stop bad actors in their tracks. And we have a few other questions here. I'm certainly not just going to read all of them off to you all, but these are just things that you can consider, right? And as I'm talking through them, I hope you can see that they really are intended to start discussion, right? So I'll just want to make that point very clear, that this is a jumping off point for you all to have those conversations at your organizations or with your clients, depending on your role. Okay. The one thing I do want to call out here is the last bullet. How often will you perform a fraud risk assessment, and what changes will initiate a reassessment? Fraud risk assessment is not a one and done activity, right? So we talked about that before. I certainly am working to make that point as clear as I can, right? We don't want to put it back on the shelf and let it collect dust. It is a tool, it's dynamic, it's iterative, it should be ongoing, and reassessments should happen and be planned for. There are many things that might trigger a reassessment, but there are certain ways you can also plan for that in your organization. So if you have a big, maybe rollout or a reorg taking place, those are things that those individual projects should probably have a fraud risk assessment, right? To understand how those changes will impact fraud. But at a minimum, you'd probably want to reconduct an assessment every year for high risk areas, and maybe every 2 or 3 years for medium to lower risk areas. So ensuring that it's not one and done, and in between the assessments, right? So you're not just going to wait 12 months and then talk about it, right? You want to make sure that you continue to talk about the assessment throughout that year. You should be implementing changes and making updates, ensuring that your organization is making those strides to improve fraud risk management. Okay. So last few slides here before I turn it back over to James. So we just wanted to call out that as part of the assessment process, you can and should use qualitative risk assessment techniques, but they are not all created equal. So interviews, surveys, and workshops, right? Each of these have areas that they're great for and areas that they really shouldn't be used. So for example, interviews. So interviews are generally appropriate for senior management or when you need to solicit input in a targeted session. Surveys are appropriate in the early stages of assessment. However, we really don't recommend relying solely on surveys. So if you do use a survey, let's say you have a very large organization, it's just not feasible that you can conduct interviews in every area. You can use a survey as a starting point and then follow up with interviews and workshops for deeper analysis, particularly in areas where you see a greater risk. And then finally, workshops, which are my personal favorite. So cross-functional workshops really are the gold standard of qualitative techniques because they bring stakeholders together for a cross-functional discussion on how risks, processes, and controls interrelate, right? So that we can understand more by breaking down those silos and having that meaningful and dynamic dialogue about fraud, risks, controls, and processes. That way we can better understand what are those gaps, what are those vulnerabilities, and how do we close them so we can stop fraud and combat it more effectively. And our big tip here is a mature risk assessment process should employ multiple techniques. So the more that you're not relying on one source of data or information, the better. You know, because assessing fraud risk can be very subjective, and there can be a big part of, you know, just our perceptions of fraud that get in the way. And so we need to ensure that as professionals, we're not just relying on that one data source. So generally in our assessment process, we leverage interviews and then lead to workshops. So we leverage interviews for individual kind of groups of stakeholders, and we bring everyone together to talk about specific fraud risks. So based on the interview, we saw that you have this control, but we also heard that it's not being implemented, that people often circumvent it, or it's very easily overridden, right? So in the workshop, we would talk about that in more detail and more depth to understand how that impacts fraud risk. So that's just a quick example there, but really understanding when these are used best and really the pros and cons of each are important. The key being we don't want to just rely on one piece of information. Okay. A final thought here on risk assessment. So as part of the risk scoring process, you should identify existing anti-fraud controls and assess their effectiveness. And that should help inform likelihood and impact and risk response. So a lot of time organizations don't focus enough on controls and processes, right? So I said that workshops are good to understand how risks, controls, and processes interrelate. And that's key. So we identify our risks in our map. We understand what the controls are, but how effective are they? And this doesn't mean that you have to go and test these controls, right? You can leverage results from audits or other reviews that are already testing these controls at the organization and just pull that information in. So based on the last 5 reviews, we saw that supervisory review is not working. Okay, so every area where we have risks where the sole control is supervisory review, those likelihood and impact scores are probably going to be higher based on that. So it's just a good way to think about it. And so we generally recommend expanding the map to create this controls matrix to align risks and controls so that you can easily understand and map where your gaps are. And then you can leverage that as you talk to stakeholders and interviews, surveys, and workshops. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to James to talk us through the rest of the plays.
Thanks, Sophia. Let's move into the next one. This is around some fraud control activities. And in this case, we're talking about using data to uncover fraud. So this is a hot topic. A lot of organizations that I talk to are eager to better leverage technology and analytics. I know there's been some questions coming in the Q&A about techniques for detecting fraud with things like Benford's Law and some of the approaches that we take. So with this, a couple comments that I want to make here. There's a bunch of different types of technology and capabilities that you can deploy for fraud detection. Some of them are very simple and some are much more complex. And so organizations sometimes struggle with wanting to implement more advanced technology, but they maybe don't have the budget for that, or they're trying to figure out which components to use. So I would say you need to find something that is the right fit for your organization and find a trusted partner to work with. If you don't have the right resources internally, you can talk to some of the technology vendors or consultants that are out there that have a better understanding of these capabilities. But what I can tell you about some of the techniques that you see here is that some of them are better than others in certain situations or to find certain types of things. Some examples of that. Business rules can be very powerful. A lot of us use those today in our business practices. Supervised predictive modeling. If you have a lot of known fraud history that you can use to train a model, you can build a very powerful predictive capability to identify suspected fraudulent behavior. But business rules and supervised predictive models, while very powerful, are really only good at finding the fraud you already know about, right? You have to have the information to build the business rule. You have to have a training data set to build a supervised predictive model. So there are other techniques that are better at detecting fraud that you may not have already found or may not have been exposed to in the past. And so those are unstructured techniques. So we might use anomaly detection or network analytics or unstructured text analytics. Those are capabilities that you can use that can detect fraud without having to have seen the behavior before, because things like anomaly detection are just looking for changes in patterns in the data, whether they're fraudulent or not. And so those different methods can be useful at different points in time. So great to take advantage of data to help detect fraud, but it's important that you find people in your organization who really understand how to use the right technology and the right methods to accomplish your objective. And so, a lot of folks ask me all the time, well, is it better to use this approach or better to use this technology? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on the quality of the data that you have. It depends on the resources and the capabilities you have within your organization. It depends on the specific type of problem you're trying to solve. So it's really important, and that's really the core issue around data science, is having a data scientist that really understands how to apply the right method based on the data and the type of business problem that you're trying to solve. So fraud detection using data analytics is really no different. So can be very powerful if you use it in the right way. Let's flip to the next one. I think we talk about under control activities, knowledge being power. So we've talked a little bit about about training. Some of you have asked some questions about how often should we educate our staff, and what's the best way to do that. And so the answer really is that we always recommend that you have at least an annual fraud awareness training in your organization. But a lot of groups that I see make this a compliance exercise, right? It's a check the box activity, and it's the same content they sit through every year, and it's boring, right? And so this is a great topic, right? It's fraud. People find it very interesting. So see if you can include some real life examples. Do you have some real fraud scenarios you've pulled out of the media, or things that you've seen at ACFE conferences? Can you make them interactive and do some role playing? And there's real benefit here, right? And so you can certainly do it through video and online, training and videos and so forth. But if you can have somewhat of an interactive experience, I think it's more memorable and people get more value out of it. And the value to your organization, as you can see on the slide here with ACFE's report to the nations, identifying almost double, right, a rate that people will provide tips through hotlines and some of those formal channels if there is a robust anti-fraud training program in place. And so by providing that training, it keeps it top of mind and really helps with that culture that Sophia referenced earlier. So again, you can be anywhere you want on the maturity curve here. You can just have some very basic check the box once a year, watch a fraud video, or you can really take this and make it more advanced and add some significant value to your organization taking that approach. So the next play focuses more, kind of shifts the principle to around investigations. So as we talked about, these first several plays are really focused on the prevention and the detection aspects of fraud. At some point, the controls that we have in place are going to fail. We know this, all of us as CFEs and folks that have been in this space for a long time know that investigations are part of the job because sometimes the controls don't work. And so what we have here is a play that talks about you can't just throw an investigation together at the last minute. You should really have a process in place. So does your organization have protocols for how to do investigations? Do you have protocols for how to communicate, how to capture evidence, how to document the investigation? What are the expectations for that part of the process? Who's in control? Who needs to be notified, right? These are things when a bad event happens, it can be very challenging if you have to figure all these things out now before you can even start doing the investigative process. So we always recommend to organizations, they spend some time making sure people understand exactly what this foundation looks like and who has the authority, who has the responsibility for taking each of these steps. And so, I think a lot of us are familiar with investigations. So we're not going to spend a ton of time on this one, but I think it's critical to have the right tools and capabilities. One example is around an effective case management system. I meet with a lot of organizations today that are struggling with the different silos in their companies. We've got a group over here that works on, let's say, internal audit, and a group over here that works on fraud investigations, and a third group that works on cybersecurity. And they all are involved in potentially addressing some of the same risks. There's a cyber event that ultimately leads to a fraud, and maybe an employee was involved. All of those groups will be involved in those investigations, but they don't have a unified technology platform to use. So they're not able to easily share intelligence within the enterprise. And that creates a real hurdle. So those are some of the things that you want to think through when you lay the groundwork. The next slide talks about actually executing the investigative process. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I think you probably have had a lot of content around investigations in the past. But we do, a lot of forensic work where clients will call and ask us to jump in and help when some of these types of negative events occur. And so, again, follow your methodology, take the steps. There's a ton of training available about how to effectively conduct investigations. So let's move to the next one, Sophia. The last two plays really are super important, but often get deprioritized. And so this is around monitoring your progress. And it's easy to focus all your energy on, you know, the exciting stuff, implementing the programs, putting the controls in place, doing the investigations. But it's important that you're keeping track about how well this process is going, right? How effective is it? Do we have key performance indicators that we're tracking? Do we have success measures? Do we know exactly what, you know, a good outcome looks like for our fraud risk management program? You should define those things, and you should be keeping track as to whether or not you're achieving those results. So you should do regular routine monitoring, have periodic evaluations, and talk to your stakeholders, the people in the lines of business, the people in your board of directors or your senior executive team, about, are you achieving the type of fraud risk posture that you would really like? And then the next one, after you're monitoring your progress, is to do reporting. So I think that's the last play that we've got here on the next slide. It talks about reporting out your progress. So it's one thing to monitor, but you need to actually explain it to other people, and you need to explain it in a way that's useful for them. And so one of the things that I see here frequently is organizations will present a dashboard or series of metrics, but they may not be providing it at the right level of detail for the intended audience. So an example would be, if you're responsible for fraud risk and you would like to give a report to the first line that's doing the day-to-day processing of transactions and involved in the work, they might want some really granular detail about exactly what the risks were, what sort of fraud events have happened, how well are the controls functioning. They want all of that detail, right? Because it's useful to them in their job. And so you might be providing a very detailed granularity to that type of audience. But if you're going to report out to a senior executive or to the board of directors or to the fraud risk committee, you probably want to summarize that information in a very different way, right? They're interested in the larger scope. They're interested in trend information. They want to know how much progress we're making and which direction are things moving. Certainly, it's good to have the detail to support any of those conversations, but you should really prepare a very different format and a different type of presentation for that type of session. So, the takeaway here, right, is that we oftentimes get so consumed with doing the first part of this process, right, implementing all the programs and doing all the work, we don't always take time to assess how well we're doing it, and then take time to make sure that we're informing the stakeholders in the right way. And this is really valuable for a couple of reasons. The biggest of which, I think, is that if we often struggle with budgets. People in our business, right, have a challenge with getting executives sometimes to understand the value of a fraud risk program, because there's no fraud happening. Well, there's no fraud happening because you have a good fraud risk program, right? So you're investing in the preventative capabilities. And if something bad does happen, you set the stage to be able to react to it and to be able to handle it in the right way, which can prevent the losses from increasing. So there's a lot of value there, but if you're just executing well and not communicating that back out to those stakeholders, they may not see it, they may not realize it. So this is one area where I strongly recommend have a process to make sure you're communicating how well are you executing against your fraud risk management program. I think that can add a lot of value when you're going to seek additional budget or additional resources or additional help in the future, to be able to explain how good a job you're doing and how it's impacting the organization. So I think the last content slide we have after this one is just around the supplemental tools that are available. So within the playbook itself is a copy of that enterprise anti-fraud maturity assessment model that Sophia showed earlier. And so that's the one where you don't necessarily have to be all the way to the right on all of those categories, but that will really help you get a good idea of sort of where you are in your organization and where you would like to be in your goal state. There's also a template for the fraud risk map. So we have a lot of uses for that. We get a lot of value out of that. And that's something that, to Sophia's point, it's not a once and done activity, right? You can create that fraud risk map and then continue to update it and have it be a live document, if you will, for your organization going forward. So, while it might be a bunch of work to kind of get that created initially, then you've got that as a takeaway that you continue to use on an ongoing basis, which is very helpful. At the link that you see at the bottom of the slide here is a site for ACFE members. You do have to log in to get access, but once you get onto that site, you can download a copy of the playbook, and you can also access the other fraud risk tools that ACFE has published on their website. And so you can see some of those examples here, things like interactive scorecards and a library of analytics tests. So some people I know in the Q&A were asking some questions about the analytic tests. There's a whole bunch of additional detail that that's available there on ACFE's website. So we were very happy to partner with ACFE to get the playbook published. Grant Thornton has been a strong proponent of the COSO work and the guide that was produced, and we're hopeful that this information in the playbook will really allow organizations to take all of that great guidance and then find sort of an actionable way to take that and implement it within their organizations. So you don't have to do the whole thing. People have asked me, do I have to do all 10 plays and build everything out? No, the goal here is for you to take whatever pieces are useful for your organization, and then hopefully that's going to help you accelerate and get a good fraud risk management program in place. So, so with that, I think we're, Sophia, that's the end of our prepared remarks. I think we just have a slide around Q&A. I see there's a whole bunch of questions that have been coming into the Q&A panel, so feel free to continue to submit those. If you don't get a chance to answer them today, we'll try to get a response back through EOD if there's anybody who would like me to respond to directly. I did get one question I would like to address.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We are living today in the age of fraud, and we need to be able to respond to this fraud at the speed of risk. We really need to update our tools. It's not anymore, like you said, about going and conducting this fraud risk assessment on an annual basis. We need to establish the framework, have the proper tools, and make sure that employees are aware, and we have the proper tools to monitor fraud on a continuous basis. And we have amazing feedback about your session. Everyone is really excited about all these concepts and tools that you are sharing with us, and all of them currently downloading the playbook, and they are trying to say, how can we create an actual action plan for us to be able to implement it. But some of the questions that we have here, very important questions. The first one, who is responsible for conducting this fraud risk assessment inside the organization?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one we get all the time. I'll answer first, Sophia, and then if you have any other thoughts. Typically in a 3-line of defense model, right, where the first line is sort of the business that's operating day to day, the second line has more of an oversight function, and the third line is more of the internal audit capability. It probably sits in the second line, although we've seen organizations do it with internal audit running the fraud risk assessment, and we've seen organizations where the front line does it. And my answer is it's important that you're doing a fraud risk assessment. And so when people say, well, we don't have the budget to hire a whole second line team to do fraud risk, we've got the people that are doing the controls day to day, and then we've got an internal audit group. My answer is great, have internal audit do it. I'd rather have somebody doing it, rather than wait for the perfect structure. Sophia, is that what you've seen as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I would just add that we've also seen wherever in the organization, whoever the champion of fraud risk management is too. So whether that's internal audit or even within the CLO office, CRO, it can sit in a lot of different places, and it's very tailored to the organization, right? I think we've said it a lot that fraud risk management should be right sized and tailored, and it always looks a little bit different.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much. Now, the second question, which is related to the first question, saying, who determine whether fraud risk response is adequate related to fraud? Is it the internal auditor, the risk management team, the CEO, the board of directors? Who is going to tell us that we have implemented the proper action to reduce the amount of fraud inside the organization?
Yeah, there's a couple different answers there. So it depends on how formal your structure is. So if you've got a formal org structure, you've got a fraud risk committee, you've got a fraud risk appetite that's been identified, right? That analysis should be done to determine whether or not the work that's being done in your fraud program is achieving the desired results with regard to your fraud risk appetite. And then if maybe you don't have all that formality, you can roll up to the broader enterprise risk capability, right? And say, okay, fraud is really an operational risk inside our organization. Are we doing the right things to maintain the right level of risk based on our risk tolerance? And that's really the determination. Sophia, any other thoughts?
No, I think that's it. That's right.
All right, perfect. We have our final question. Based on the last 6 months, since you have published this playbook, what can you see the new play games that, these fraudsters are doing in this pandemic during Corona? Do you see any kind of, new moves they are taking and anything that we can do about it?
Absolutely. It's a great question. And we know that fraud tends to increase in any kind of recessionary economic environment. So that aspect of the pandemic that we're in, we know that the fraud rate's going to increase. And so organizations, folks that ask us, how frequently should we update our risk assessment? Well, you should do it at least once a year. But, when there's a major change in your business, maybe you acquire another company or you introduce new offerings, you probably need to make an update. I think the pandemic is a good example of a scenario that's so significant as an impact to your business. You should be updating your fraud risk posture, right, to make sure that you're properly addressing those risks. We see a lot of funding provided by governments associated with the pandemic, right, looking to provide funding to small businesses or provide medical equipment. All of those different programs are all subject to fraud. And what we're seeing in the United States is the rate of fraud with those programs was anticipated to be about 5%. It looks like it's probably more about 30%. So that the rate of fraud is enormous right now. So we're seeing a lot in related areas as well. As those funds are stolen, there's more mule account activity for our friends that do money laundering work, for example, need to be better monitoring and identifying all those types of behaviors. So absolutely a great time because of the pandemic to make sure that your fraud risk management program is up to snuff, because we have seen just an explosion in all the traditional frauds, new account frauds, account takeover frauds, phishing schemes. All of those things are escalating in the pandemic environment.
I would just add to that, due to the pandemic, we've also seen a really big rise, to James' point, of phishing and social engineering. So think of like fake emails from who or other organizations putting out information on the virus, or other types of charity scams, healthcare fraud with the rise of telemedicine, right? So really the scams and fraud are coming from all angles. And so the best thing that we can do is understand what those emerging risks are and ensure that the people that we're working with, so within our own organizations and even our friends and family, have that awareness of those schemes, so they don't click on that link in an email they get, or they don't download that app, right, that we think it might be malicious. So just staying aware is really important during these times as fraudsters continue to evolve and iterate on their tactics.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. And we have amazing feedback from our delegates. And definitely, like they say, you can't actually boil the ocean. So what we need to do, we need to look at our organization and find which one is the highest risk area inside the organization, and start working step by step by implementing the proper anti-fraud strategy for us to be able to reduce that risk and work from there to be able to go all over the organization and make sure that fraud is the last thing we need to be concerned about when we are trying to achieve our objective. With that, I would like to thank James and Sophia for this amazing presentation. I would like to thank all of you for joining us for this global webinar. This is one of the most anticipated topics in our series, and it was really amazing to have all of you with us. With that is the conclusion of our webinar. Thank you so much, James and Sophia, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.